In the winter of 1959, deep in the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union, a group of 9 experienced hikers set out on what they expected would be an ambitious yet exhilarating trek. They were young, full of energy, and accustomed to the brutal conditions of the Russian wilderness. Most of them were students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, skilled in survival and mountaineering. Their leader, Igor Dyatlov, was just 23 years old, but his reputation for careful planning and leadership had made him well respected among his peers. None of them could have imagined that their journey would become one of the most enduring and terrifying mysteries of the 20th century. The group's goal was to reach Otorten Mountain, a remote and largely unvisited peak in the far north. On January 25th, they began their journey by train, traveling northward into the frozen emptiness. Over the next several days, they trekked through snow-covered forests and across icy rivers, sometimes laughing together as they sang songs to keep their spirits high. They documented everything meticulously in journals and photographs, which is why the later investigation had such a detailed record of their movements. On February 1st, after battling harsh winds and temperatures that fell well below freezing, they reached the slopes of Khalat Siakal, a name that in the language of the local Mansi people means Mountain of the Dead. The Mansi avoided the area, and in later interviews some described it as cursed. The group, however, were scientists and students. They dismissed the superstitions as nothing more than folklore and decided to camp on an exposed slope rather than descend to the forest below for shelter. It was a strange decision given the conditions, but perhaps they had wanted to gain experience camping in extreme weather or had simply run out of daylight. That night something happened. No one truly knows what. The camp was discovered weeks later, abandoned and eerily silent. The search party that found it reported that the hikers' tent had been slashed open from the inside. Their belongings were still there, including boots, jackets, and essential gear. Tracks in the snow led away from the tent, but what disturbed the searchers most was that many of the footprints were made by bare or only sock-covered feet, even though the temperature had been around -30 degrees Celsius. Following the tracks for some distance, the rescuers came upon the first bodies. 2 men were found near the remains of a small campfire under a large cedar tree. They were dressed only in underwear and light shirts. Their skin was darkened, as if burned or frostbitten, and their hands were stripped of skin, suggesting they had tried desperately to climb the tree to escape something. A few hundred meters away, the body of Igor Dyatlov was found lying on his back in the snow, his fists clenched and a look of frozen determination still on his face. Nearby lay another member of the group, also facing the direction of the tent as though trying to return. It took months before the rest of the bodies were discovered, buried beneath snow in a ravine further down the slope. These hikers were dressed more warmly, as if they had taken clothing from their fallen friends. Some had suffered severe internal injuries without any external wounds, the kind of trauma more often seen in car accidents than in accidents in the mountains. One woman was missing her tongue and eyes. Another's skull was fractured in a way that suggested a tremendous force had struck her, yet there were no signs of struggle in the surrounding snow. Radiation was found on some of their clothing, though the source was never explained. The official Soviet investigation concluded that the group had died from what they called a compelling natural force, a phrase so vague it only deepened the mystery. Over the years, countless theories emerged. Some believed the hikers had been caught in an avalanche, yet the slope's angle and the condition of the tent seemed to contradict that. Others suggested they had been attacked by wild animals, though there were no bite marks or claw wounds. There were even whispers that the hikers had stumbled upon a secret military experiment, perhaps a weapons test, and had been silenced to protect the secret. Among the most unsettling accounts came from the local Mansi people, who insisted the mountain was haunted and that strange lights had been seen in the skis in the days around the hikers' deaths. Indeed, some of the search party claimed they too had witnessed glowing orbs floating silently above the snowfields. This led to speculation about UFOs and extraterrestrial involvement, a theory that was dismissed by authorities, but has remained popular among those who find the other explanations lacking. Even the hikers' diaries contained odd moments that seemed to hint at unease. One entry, written just a day before their deaths, mentioned strange whistling sounds in the night. Another noted that they had taken an unusual detour without explaining why. Photographs found in their cameras included images of what appear to be bright lights in the darkness, though some experts argue these were simply artifacts of damaged film. The ambiguity only fuels the fascination with the case. When the bodies were returned to their families, some relatives described them as having an unnatural orange hue to their skin. Soviet officials discouraged further questions, and for decades the case files were kept classified. Those who tried to investigate too deeply often found themselves facing bureaucratic obstacles or thinly veiled threats. In time, the tragedy became known as the Dyatlov Pass incident, and it has never truly left the public imagination. Modern investigators have tried to re-examine the case using advanced technology. Some have suggested that a rare phenomenon called infrasound, produced by wind interacting with the mountain's shape, could have induced panic and caused the hikers to flee in a disoriented state. Others have pointed to the possibility of a slab avalanche, in which a block of compacted snow breaks loose without leaving the typical debris. Yet none of these explanations account for all the details, such as the radiation, the missing tongue, and the eyewitness accounts of strange lights. There is also a human element to the horror. Imagining the final moments of the hikers' lives is a chilling exercise. Picture them suddenly forced from their tent in the blackness of night, with the wind howling and the temperature so cold that exposed skin would begin to freeze in minutes. They were barefoot or nearly so, stumbling through deep snow, perhaps pursued by something they could not see. Some tried to build a fire, others tried to return to the tent, but in that vast and merciless wilderness there was no chance of survival. Whatever they encountered on that slope drove them to actions that defied logic and ultimately led to their deaths. The site where they perished has since become a place of pilgrimage for adventurers and curiosity seekers. A small memorial stands there, bearing the names of the 9 hikers who never came back. Locals still avoid it after dark, and some claim that even in daylight the place has an oppressive atmosphere. Those who camp nearby sometimes report waking in the night to hear faint whistling in the wind, or the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow just outside their tents, though no one is ever there. In 2019, 60 years after the tragedy, Russian authorities reopened the investigation, but their conclusion was anticlimactic. They officially stated that an avalanche combined with poor visibility and freezing temperatures was the cause. For many, this explanation felt incomplete, almost dismissive. It could not fully explain why the hikers had cut open their tent from within, why some suffered injuries comparable to a car crash, or why traces of radiation were present. The reopening of the case only reignited the mystery rather than resolving it. Perhaps the truth lies buried beneath the snow and ice, beyond the reach of any future search. Or perhaps it is something that can never be fully understood, a reminder that there are still places in this world where nature, or something beyond nature, holds sway over human lives. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains not just a tragedy, but a riddle carved into the frozen mountains, a story told in the silence of the Ural winds. Even now, when the moon rises over Khalat Siekle and the wind sweeps through the passes, those who have been there swear they can hear faint voices carried on the air. Some say it is only the wind, but others insist it is the sound of the hikers calling to one another in their final desperate moments, forever lost in the snow. And if you listen long enough, you might feel a sudden chill at the back of your neck, as though the mountain itself is watching, waiting for the next soul to wander too far into its domain. In the quiet town of Villisca, Iowa, there stands an old white house that seems almost ordinary at first glance. Its wooden siding is weathered by decades of wind and rain, and its simple design reflects the rural architecture of the early 20th century. Yet for more than 100 years, this house has carried a darkness that has never lifted. The locals call it the Villisca Axe Murder House, and the story behind it is one of the most chilling in American history. On the morning of June 10, 1912, the small community of Villisca woke to a shocking discovery. The Moore family, well liked and respected in the town, had failed to appear for their usual daily activities. Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children were known for being punctual, and it was unlike them to miss Sunday services or school commitments. Concern began to grow when neighbors noticed the blinds drawn tight and no movement inside. Eventually, a relative was sent to check on them. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside the modest home, every member of the Moore family lay dead, along with 2 young girls who had been staying the night as guests. All 8 victims had been brutally murdered with an axe. The blows were so severe that some of the ceilings bore marks where the weapon had swung. The crime scene was grisly, but what made it even more disturbing were the details that hinted at something far stranger than a simple home invasion. Investigators determined that the murders had occurred sometime after midnight. The killer had moved methodically from room to room, striking each victim as they slept. The faces of the adults were covered with sheets, and pieces of clothing had been draped over the children's heads. All the mirrors in the house had been covered, as if the murderer could not bear to look at reflections. The doors were locked from the inside, suggesting that whoever had done this had either escaped before dawn or perhaps lingered in the house afterward. The town was thrown into a state of panic. In 1912, Villisca was a place where people rarely locked their doors, where everyone knew their neighbors by name. The idea that someone could commit such an atrocity in the middle of the night and vanish without a trace was almost unthinkable. For weeks, residents began carrying firearms and keeping their lights on through the night. Some even refused to sleep until the sun rose. The investigation drew in law enforcement from all over the region, but leads were scarce. Several suspects were questioned, including a traveling minister who had been seen in town the night of the murders. He reportedly confessed to the crime in a rambling statement, but later recanted, claiming he had been driven by visions from God to say what he did. Other suspects included a local businessman with a grudge against Josiah Moore and a wandering ex-convict who had been spotted near the train station. Yet none of the evidence was strong enough to secure a conviction. In time, the case went cold. What lingered, however, was the house itself. Neighbors began reporting strange occurrences almost immediately after the murders. At night, they claimed to see flickering lights in the windows, as if someone were walking through the rooms with a lantern. Others heard the faint sound of children laughing and playing inside, even though the home was empty. More disturbing still, some swore they heard muffled cries or the dull thud of heavy footsteps packing back and forth. Over the decades, the house changed hands many times, often at a suspiciously low price. Tenants rarely stayed long. Some left after only a few weeks, citing a constant feeling of being watched or the sudden appearance of cold spots that seemed to follow them from room to room. One family claimed they awoke in the night to find the bedroom door slowly opening on its own, and in the dim moonlight, they could make out the silhouette of a man holding an axe. When they turned on the light, the figure vanished without a trace. Paranormal investigators have since flocked to the Villisca Axe Murder House, drawn by its grim history and reputation for supernatural activity. Many report hearing disembodied voices during their visits. Some capture strange orbs of light or shadowy figures on film. Others describe feeling an overwhelming sense of dread upon entering the upstairs bedroom where the 2 visiting girls were found. It is in this room, according to local lore, that the energy feels most oppressive, as if something still lingers there, replaying that terrible night over and over. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case is the precision with which the killer acted. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that the murderer might have been someone the Moores knew or someone who had hidden in the house before the family went to bed. Some modern investigators have speculated that the killer might have been inside for hours, possibly sitting quietly in the attic, listening as the household settled down for the night. The thought of a stranger lurking silently above while the family went about their evening is almost as terrifying as the murders themselves. In 1994, the house was restored to its 1912 condition and opened to the public for tour and overnight stays. Those who dare to spend the night often leave with stories of their own. Visitors have reported being woken by the sound of footsteps climbing the stairs, only to find no one there. Some have heard the distinct creak of a rocking chair moving in the parlor, even though no such chair exists in the house today. A few have claimed to feel an invisible hand brush against them in the darkness, or the sensation of breath on the back of their neck. Perhaps the most famous modern incident occurred in 2014, when a visitor staying overnight was found in the morning with a self-inflicted stab wound. He survived, but told authorities that he had been overcome by an uncontrollable urge to harm himself while inside the house, as if something had taken hold of his thoughts. This event reignited debate about whether the Villisca Axe murder house is truly haunted, or whether its dark history exerts a psychological influence on those who enter. Skeptics argue that the paranormal activity is the result of suggestion and fear. They believe that visitors who know the house's history may interpret normal creaks and drafts as something supernatural. Yet even the most rational minds admit that there is something deeply unsettling about the place. Whether or not it is haunted, the fact remains that 8 innocent people were slaughtered there in their sleep, and the killer was never brought to justice. In the small upstairs bedrooms, the original wood floors are still scarred and worn. The walls seem to close in, and the silence is so complete that even the faintest noise feels amplified. For some, this silence is the worst part, because it forces you to imagine the sounds that broke it on that night in 1912. The slow tread of footsteps across the floor, the creak of the bed as someone leans over a sleeping victim, the sudden, brutal swing of an axe. And then nothing but darkness and the slow settling of dust in the air. Over a century later, the mystery remains unsolved. Historians and amateur detectives continue to pore over old newspaper clippings, autopsy reports, and witness statements, hoping to uncover some overlooked detail that might reveal the truth. But the deeper one digs, the more questions emerge. Why did the killer spare no one, not even the children? Why cover the mirrors and the victims' faces? And why choose that house, that family, on that particular night? Some believe the answers are lost forever, buried with the victims in the quiet Villisca cemetery where their graves lie side by side. Others think the killer may have been responsible for similar unsolved murders in other towns during that era, part of a string of crimes committed by a transient who moved along the railways. If that is true, then the Villisca murders were just one chapter in a much larger and even darker story. Today, the house stands as both a historical landmark and a place of pilgrimage for those fascinated by the macabre. Tourists walk through the narrow hallways and climb the steep staircase, their footsteps echoing on the old wood. Some leave with nothing more than photographs and a chill down their spine. Others leave convinced they have encountered something they cannot explain. When the sun sets and the last visitors depart, the house grows quiet once again. In that stillness, some say you can hear faint whispers drifting down from the attic, or the sound of children giggling softly before being shushed. Perhaps it is only the imagination playing tricks, or perhaps it is a reminder that whatever happened in that small Iowa house on the night of June 9, 1912, has never truly ended. It lingers still, in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very air, waiting for the next person to listen closely enough to hear it. In the deep swamps of southern Louisiana, where the air is thick with humidity and the cypress trees loom over still waters, there is a small rural town called St. Francisville. It is a place of quiet roads and ancient plantations, where the past is never far away. Among its most famous sites is the Myrtles plantation, an elegant antebellum home built in 1796. It has been called one of the most haunted houses in the United States, a place where beauty and horror exist side by side. The Myrtles was originally built by General David Bradford, who fled Pennsylvania after being involved in the Whiskey Rebellion. The grand house became a symbol of Southern refinement, with wide verandas, towering oak trees, and sprawling grounds. Yet behind the charm of its white columns and lace curtains, tragedy took root early and never seemed to leave. Over the centuries, the plantation has been the site of numerous deaths, many under mysterious or violent circumstances, and it is said that the restless spirits of those who suffered here still wander the property. The most famous and enduring legend tied to the Myrtles is that of Chloe, a slave owned by Clark and Sarah Woodruff, who lived in the house in the early 1800s. According to one version of the story, Chloe was brought into the household as a domestic servant, working close to the family. She quickly learned that proximity to the master could be both a privilege and a danger. Some say Clark Woodruff forced her into an unwanted relationship, and fearing she might be sent back to the fields, Chloe eavesdropped on the family's conversations through keyholes to stay informed. One day, Clark caught her listening and, as punishment, ordered one of her ears cut off. From that moment, Chloe wore a green turban to hide the wound. Desperate to regain her position in the household, she allegedly hatched a plan. She baked a birthday cake for one of the Woodruff children and secretly mixed a small amount of poison into the batter, thinking it would make the family mildly ill so she could nurse them back to health and earn their gratitude. But the plan went horribly wrong. Sarah Woodruff and 2 of her children died that night in agony. When the other slaves discovered what had happened, they feared Clark's wrath would fall on all of them. To protect themselves, they dragged Chloe from her quarters and hanged her from a tree. Her body was then thrown into the river. Some claim that from that day forward, her spirit has remained on the plantation, wearing the same green turban, wandering the halls and watching from the shadows. While historians debate the accuracy of Chloe's story, many visitors and owners of the Myrtles swear they have seen her. She is often described as a tall figure in a long dress, her face partly obscured, gliding silently across rooms before fading into thin air. In 1992, a well-known photograph was taken during a renovation of the house, showing what appears to be the figure of a woman standing between 2 buildings. The image was studied by experts who could not conclusively explain it. The Myrtles' haunted reputation is not limited to Chloe. Over the years, guests have reported hearing footsteps on the grand staircase when no one else was in the house. Others describe the sound of children laughing in empty rooms or the soft weeping of a woman in the dead of night. In some bedrooms, antique mirrors seem to hold strange handprints that cannot be wiped away. In one of these mirrors, some say the faces of Sarah Woodruff and her children occasionally appear, as if trapped within the glass. One of the most disturbing stories involves a later owner, William Winter. In 1871, Winter was shot by a stranger who rode up to the plantation. He staggered inside, collapsing on the 17th step of the staircase, where he died in his wife's arms. Many guests claim they have heard the sound of heavy boots climbing those stairs, always stopping at the 17th step before fading into silence. The house's history is littered with more than a dozen deaths, many of which are well documented. Yellow fever outbreaks, duels, accidental deaths, and even unsolved murders seem to cling to the place. Local lore says the plantation was built on the site of an old Tunica Indian burial ground, which might explain why the ground itself feels charged with unease. The combination of historical tragedy and the belief in spiritual unrest has made the Myrtles a magnet for paranormal investigators. Overnight guests have told of waking in the small hours to find the covers slowly sliding off their beds, as if pulled by invisible hands. Some wake to see a figure standing at the foot of the bed, staring silently, only for it to vanish the moment they switch on a light. A few have described being gently touched or having their hair tugged when no one else was near. Even staff who work at the Myrtles during the day admit to strange experiences. Tour guides sometimes hear their own names whispered in their ears when the room is otherwise empty. Doors open and close on their own. Glasses rattle on tabletops as if from a distant vibration, though no trucks or heavy vehicles are anywhere near. On one occasion, a large chandelier began swinging slowly in the dining room during a quiet afternoon, continuing for several minutes before coming to a sudden, unnatural stop. Skeptics often dismiss the stories as products of imagination, influenced by the plantation's dark history and its gothic atmosphere. Yet those who have experienced the phenomena insist there is something there, something they cannot explain. Even professional paranormal teams, equipped with cameras, audio recorders, and thermal sensors, have left the Myrtles with evidence they find difficult to debunk. Recordings have captured faint voices answering questions, sometimes in French, a language once spoken by the plantation's early residents. In photos, orbs and strange mists appear in rooms that should be empty. Perhaps what makes the Myrtles so unnerving is that it is still a functioning bed and breakfast. Guests check in, stroll the grounds, enjoy breakfast on the veranda, and then, when night falls, find themselves lying awake in the same rooms where tragedy once unfolded. The quiet of the surrounding countryside only deepens the sense of isolation. Crickets and frogs sing in the distance, and the massive oaks creak in the breeze. Somewhere in that darkness, a floorboard groans or a faint knock echoes from the hallway. Some visitors have left in the middle of the night, too unsettled to stay until morning. Others leave convinced they have made contact with the dead. One guest described waking to find a woman in a green turban leaning over her bed, her expression unreadable. She closed her eyes in fear, and when she opened them again the room was empty, though the scent of something sweet like baked cake still lingered in the air. The Myrtles plantation remains a paradox, drawing both history enthusiasts and thrill seekers. In daylight it is breathtakingly beautiful, a relic of the Old South with its gardens, antiques, and sweeping views. At night, however, it transforms into something else entirely. The air feels heavy. The shadows seem to move on their own. Even those who arrive skeptical often leave with the uneasy feeling that they have been watched. Over 2 centuries have passed since the Myrtles was built, yet its legend continues to grow. Books, documentaries, and countless personal accounts have cemented its reputation as one of America's most haunted homes. Whether the spirits that roam its halls are the tragic victims of its bloody history or the creations of human imagination, one thing is certain: the Myrtles plantation has a presence that is impossible to ignore. If you stand on the veranda late at night and look toward the darkened windows, you might see the faint outline of a figure moving inside. You might hear the distant laughter of children carried on the warm Louisiana air. And if you are unlucky, you might feel a cold breath at your ear and hear a whisper in a voice you do not recognize.